Hi, everybody. Matt Yankovic, Head of Open Source Strategy here at Percona, here to talk to you about Percona's community efforts, specifically what is going on with evangelism, our OSPO role, community management, share a little bit, hopefully some people learn, but also we're trying to hire a few people and wanted to clarify any confusion because not everyone runs their community the exact same way. So let's go ahead and talk about that. So, again, Matt Yankovic, this is me. If you haven't heard from me before, I do a podcast. I am the head of open source strategy here at Percona. Head of open source strategy is renamed the HOSS. So, if you hear that name or see me around, you'll know why and what that is. I've been around for Percona for, 13, 14 years now, variety of different roles. But right now, my role is everything community related, whether that's OSPO, whether that's evangelism, or community management. It all kind of falls under the same bucket. So I mentioned that I'm hiring, and this is really the selfish purpose for this conversation. We are trying to hire some technical evangelists or DevRel people, if you will. Often those terms are used synonymously. And as I've talked with people over the last 6 to 9 months in the community space, I found that there's a lot of differences between how companies run their communities and what they're looking for, even if the positions or the titles are named the exact same thing. And this is kind of confusing for candidates. And some of the people that I've talked to, they assume that they're going to do one thing and maybe they do something completely different. Good example of this, talked to one person who is only, his role as an evangelist, and his focus is solely on contributing code to other projects. And that's how they do evangelism at his particular company. And so that is one way that they've implemented DevRel. It can be different for other companies. I've talked to a few other people who their DevRel folks not only do some public speaking, but their main process is going through and contributing, or going through the contributed code and trying to help contributors get code into their open source project. So again, different roles, same title. And so it can be confusing when you go out there and you see someone advertising for a tech evangelist or a DevRel person. Everybody does it a little differently. So because of those differences, I figured it would be good to just sit down and maybe tell people who are interested in either our roles or other roles out in the community some tips and tricks on what to ask and what to look out for, and explain how we're doing things. Maybe that will help some other people crystallize what they want to do in the future. Maybe it will help some other people decide what their company should be hiring for. So I mentioned that no one size fits all. It's super important to understand that. There are a lot of different ways to tackle the community, team and build it out. But I think it's really about matching the program and the positions to what your ultimate outcome is. Because each company has different outcomes they're looking for, and they have different requirements that they're looking to get out of their community space. So understanding those outcomes is super critical, not only for the candidate, but for the company themselves. I've talked about, companies in the past here on my, channel and on my podcast who have come out and said, we don't want anybody to contribute code. We only adopted open source for the adoption, for the freemium, for the marketing aspect of it. In that case, having people in, a community role in that company, it's probably going to be more focused on the adoption. And most of the metrics will be aligned. Most of the activities will be aligned for that. Other companies, like I mentioned, it's all about gaining contributors to their code base, right? So how do you pull in more PRs? How do you get more people engaged in that community? How do you get more people to come to the dev meetings, to share their feedback, to try out new features? All those things become very important. Now, there are all kinds of other reasons people get involved, and these reasons are just a few, and a lot of times what you'll find is 2 or 3 of these are legitimate for any one company. It's not necessarily that there is one aspect that they're looking at that will solve all their issues. Very common that the larger the organizations get, the more there's a person for almost every type of function, or even a team for every type of function as well, right? So a lot of times in large companies, you'll have OSPO people whose main role is this last line here, which I'm kind of hiding behind, which is ensure compliance with licenses. Or maybe ensure compliance with licenses and get more people to use open source versus going out and buying packages that are proprietary. That could be an entire role at a large company. Smaller companies, you might have all of these things on your plate and you might be a single person. It's hard to tell. So as you talk with people, as you look at jobs, if you're interested in technical evangelism and open source program office role, find out what the outcome is. What is the goal of this open source project? Are they doing it to get contributors, or are they doing it because they want to gain adoption? Or maybe they're doing it because they just want to contribute to open source upstream. All of these are valid reasons, but they change the role significantly, and the personality almost changes with who's a good fit for those roles. So let's talk a little bit about, starting to ask that why, right? Again, super important to ask why, what's going on, why are you doing this? Why, this particular open source project? So let's talk about Percona's why for the community and where the community team this year is focused. And keep in mind, whys can change over time, right? And so ours has been pretty consistent. We've always been focused on keeping open source as open and freely available as possible in the database space. But we have some very specific things we're trying to do this year. And, this is going to dictate the people who work on the community team what they're going to be working on. So the first one we're trying to accomplish is we think that there's a problem where developers aren't developing their databases as structured and as clean as they could be, right? As technology has made it easier to just do push-button deployments, there's a lot of automation. A lot of people use the database as a dumping ground. And so we think that we can help application developers and users develop better applications by ensuring that their database designs are set up to be scalable and secure. And we have a tool, our PMM tool, that we think can help developers do that. And so we're doing a lot of education around that. And we're really looking for people to try and use it, right? This is about adoption. So when I talked about whys, right? So for our community why, one of them is adoption, and it's adoption of our PMM. We think that this can help people build better code. Pretty simple, straightforward. But we also want contributors to PMM. So one of the things that our Percona monitoring management does is it allows you to build and add advisors and dashboards to get more data on what your application's actually doing. So having an advisor that says you deployed this code and these problems exist is a very cool thing and very useful, and it's key to us. So enabling end users, developers, SREs to build advisors and add them to the ecosystem and make them available to other people is going to be critical for us, because we want to share that knowledge. And so using not only those advisors that we've built and we provide, but enabling those other users to build their own, especially for very specific workloads, is going to be something that's important. So adoption, contributors. Now, our second goal is looking at the infrastructure space and how you add and build databases from the ground up. As you lay the foundation for that, more and more people are turning to database as a service. And as a database as a service, you're looking for those efficiencies, the consistencies. You're looking for some things that enable your teams to move faster and spend less cycles on the mundane operations. We think that, a lot of people have chosen the public cloud for this because there hasn't been options that have been really good without building your own in the hybrid space or in the Kubernetes space up until the last couple of years. And we think that by taking some of the techniques and things we've learned and applying them to a Kubernetes environment, we can bring you that public database as a service ease of use with all the benefits of Kubernetes, with all of the awesomeness that we've learned over the last few years on scalability, security, and performance, right? So, hey, let's give you a platform that you can go take and you can make your own database as a service. You can make your own efficient ways that are really easy to deploy databases and manage them. That's a win for everybody. So we want to get adoption with, not only our tooling to do that, which you can do through PMM, but also Kubernetes operators, the different open source databases that we support. And we want people to take that, what they're learning, what they're doing, and contribute back, right? So there are other operations that they might want to see automated that other people could benefit from. And so that's where those contributions come into play. Again, adoption, contribution. Now, the last one is something that we've been doing for 15 years now, which is trying to be a very good member of the open source and database communities. And what I mean by that is we've always believed that if the open source database overall pie grows, we do better. So we don't need to just talk about our products. We also want to talk about open source in general and databases in the open source space in general. So how do we evangelize how you do things with MySQL or Postgres or Mongo without necessarily having to have that, singular tie back to one of Percona's tools? These are benefits for the end user and the community. And the more people who use those technologies, the more we can all benefit. So again, adoption and contributions. That's where we're really focused when we're talking about technical evangelism. Now, what sort of activities and things have we been doing in this space? Now, right now we're adding some folks, so we want to do more. But you might have seen us over the last few months at various functions. You may have read some of our content. So I'm going to just throw a few things out here in case you're interested. But we've spoken at several conferences. We've had a keynote recently in person, which, in-person conferences, we're getting back to them. We've started to do live streams and meetups online. We do a regular podcast. We've published tons of blogs on the Percona blog. And we've enabled our Percona internal staff to do more, as well as our external contributors. Now, it's interesting because a lot of these activities are not necessarily 100% owned and built by Percona's community. And similarly, in a lot of companies, it's not just a community effort, it's an entire company effort because the whole company is part of community in that regard. When we talk about blogs, for instance, there are a lot of blogs who come from our service engineers. Some of the best blogs come from, things that they're doing with customers or problems they've run into during their normal days. And those are activities that, we want to encourage and facilitate. So it's really important for us to do that. But these are external things that we're doing on a regular basis right now. And there's a lot more that we're doing that you may not have seen, right? And a lot of the work that you have to do when you're talking about an OSPO or a community team is establish that culture that you want, like a default to open culture, or also if you have a culture that's already open, reinforce it. As you start to experience growth, as you add people, and successful companies are generally growing the number of people that they have. Every new hire potentially changes the culture. And so it's important to continue to instill, the values across the organization. And a lot of times when you have a team that's focused on the open source side or the open source program office, it's their responsibility to help with that, culture education. They produce content, they try and, help people understand the benefits of what you're doing in the open source space, but they'll also bring some of the open source awesomeness externally. So a lot of what we've been doing lately is looking at what we can do to bring more of Percona's internal external. So how do we move that more to open, whether that's engineering meetings, roadmap meetings, other things. We want more out in the public. Now, we also do a lot of testing, and we do a lot of work with our engineering or our service teams to try and make sure things are working properly. We test things out. We benchmark. We ensure that as new releases come up, we have some idea on what they do so we can talk about them. And a lot of times we'll find issues and we'll help debug things. We also do a lot of collection and talking in the community to get feedback. So the more we can understand and the more we can provide engineers with how their products are being used in the real world, the better off we are. This is one of the things that's often overlooked in a lot of community spaces, is that feedback loop. And to be honest with you, I have not met an engineer who doesn't tell me they need more feedback. It's a consistent universal thing. And so we want to engage with the community and provide that feedback. Now, part of that is also making sure that those users have a voice and that you can not only provide the feedback, but you can make sure that when there's new things that are happening or changes in the market, or there's things that are important to certain user groups, that you can make sure that those are visible. And you want to make sure that they not only do that to engineering, but as they learn, your community learns, that you give them a platform to share what they've learned, so they become external evangelists for you as well. So that kind of process is very important. Now, I've used these terms a couple times, so I think I should explain them. So there's a couple of different roles at Percona's community, and everybody that I've talked to, I kind of see these three crystallize in most organizations as well. It doesn't mean there's three people for these, but it's almost three unique functions. In a lot of places, this is one person, but it could be more. So the first one is the classic DevRel evangelism advocate role, right? It's the awareness, the wow, it's the education. It's someone who is somewhat technical, maybe very technical, who is out there putting themselves out and showing people how to do more with the products, with the project, with whatever you're trying to show them. This is very heavily tied into that adoption play in a lot of cases, and also the contributor play. But it's really about how to inspire and enable people to do more. Now, community management, often this is rolled into a same role, but community management is a slightly different role, right? So when we talk about community management, a lot of time community managers are very visible in the public, but they're not out there talking specifically about the technology and sharing how to do things with the technology. A lot of times they're there to build and facilitate the community channels, whether that's Twitter, whether that's LinkedIn, whether that's your Discord, making sure that they're running, making sure questions are answered, finding the right people for those questions, making sure that, as people contribute, they get recognized, or tracking the metrics around, these different programs. So that community management piece is something that's really critical. And oftentimes, it's moved to one or more of the other two roles. And that can work, especially in smaller organizations, but the larger organizations, there's a lot of other things that you could be doing in that space. And the final one is the OSPO role. And this one has really grown quite substantially over the last few years. OSPO stands for Open Source Program Office. And this is, in some companies, a catch-all for everything. Other companies, it is very specific to a legal compliance and project management type role. So be mindful that not all OSPOs are created equal, especially if you go to a company that is internal, not producing open source software directly as their product. If it's part of their strategy, or it's part, they're trying to adopt more. This can be very different than an OSPO role in a company that is producing open source software and is trying to get contributions and manage an entire ecosystem. So very different. But what do those activities look like in kind of the real world, and what are some samples? These are some of the things how we've set up the differences in where different functionality lies. This isn't an all exhaustive list, but you can see that there are very different activities in each bucket, right? So evangelism, you've got these podcasts, meetups, you're speaking at conferences, you're writing blogs, you're doing example code. right? Software how-tos, all these different activities in the evangelism bucket to really help people try and use your software or use your project. Whereas community management, you have a lot more process and administration, right? So getting speakers at conferences. Once the speakers are at conferences, how do we promote them? How do we make sure people know that they're there? How do we connect with different people at that conference? Manage the website or the content for a community. Maybe you're sending out swag on a regular basis. What does that program look like? Maybe you have social programs. How do you handle sponsorships? How do you manage the forums, right? So there's all kinds of things within community management that happen. And it doesn't necessarily need someone who is well-versed in one of the technologies. It certainly helps. But the end goal generally isn't focused specifically on the technology and adoption of the technology with technical content, whereas the evangelism is. And the OSPO here at Percona, that role or that function is really about the contributor process and what we're trying to do to instill, not only internal, contributions to other projects going external, but also external coming in, right? So how do we enable that? How do we ensure that things that we're contributing up follow the right license scheme or CLAs? Also working on things like overall budgeting programs, optimizing and tuning things for that contributor process, making it easier to be part of the contributors. So you can see there's a logical breakdown here. And in a lot of cases, you'll have 2 or 3 of these be one person. Right now, I do evangelism and OSPO work and a tad of community management, but we have a really good community management team right now. So as we build out evangelism, I'll float around a little bit more. But there isn't one size that fits all for a lot of companies. It's aligned to what their goals are. Now, one of the things that I've mentioned a couple times is contributor. And this is where there is a lot of debate, and I've been following the Twitterverse the last few weeks, and this debate continues to kind of go back and forth. A lot of people feel that they can't contribute to open source projects, or they aren't an open source project because they're not writing code. That is a mistake, right? Contributions are more than code. This is an important thing to understand. Now, when we talk specifically about contributions at Percona, here's what I'm looking at, right? This list, right? Blog posts, forum posts, external reviews, code contributions, bugs reported, participation in Jira and GitHub, so that feedback loop, or the feedback loop I have later on too, conference speaking, and videos, podcasts, different things. If you are talking to other people in the community about the community, about helping to make them better, you're doing things that are of value to that community, right? A lot of times, documentation, for instance, it's one of those things that everybody tries to get better documentation, but documentation only takes you so far. What are the use cases and how you actually use this in production or in a real world scenario is often missing, and those often come in the form of blog posts or videos or tutorials, conference talks. Those are often more valuable in terms of documentation than the documentation itself. And so how do you foster and grow that? It's an important thing, and you have to make sure that you focus on that. Now, we here internally, what we do is we actually take all these to try and equalize and come up with a single number for our contributors, because we don't want to just say like, oh, there's one class of contributors who's better than everybody else, because, realistically, those who are starting out, and if they can verify a bug, it can be just as valuable as someone who's, pushing a new PR request with, a few hundred lines of code. So how do you value that? How do you set that up? And how do you make sure that you push not only the code contributions forward, but these other contributions that are often overlooked? And that's what we focus on, is all these different activities. Now, this is where I come back to my obligatory advertisement for my position. So I mentioned I am hiring for technical evangelists. So if you've watched this video, if you've made it this far through, congratulations. You're on the short list. But you kind of see what we're doing with technical evangelists / DevRel. If that is something that interests you, I would encourage you to have a conversation with us. Now, a few points specifically on this particular role, and I want to articulate who's a good fit. Look, we don't need a 30-year veteran of the database field or a 10-year, MySQL DBA or someone who is a core contributor to, Postgres. Hey, if that's you and you want this role, I would love to talk to you. It's awesome. But don't be afraid if you're not. Okay? The most important skills, in my opinion, and what I look for people who are going to be public and going to have that visibility, is a passion and an ability to tell stories, to talk to people. Not only that, but the ability to learn quickly and do so publicly and be able to kind of teach as you learn, like learn in the open. Wow, that's incredibly valuable. And that makes a great evangelist or a great DevRel person, right? Because if you have a passion about what you're trying to learn, you're excited about it, you can tell a story and you can do it publicly as you learn it, and you're willing to fail and share your failures. That's the basis for building, a really strong DevRel team. And so don't be shy about that, right? If you don't have that expert level knowledge, it's okay. And, if you have that, that's okay too. And, even if you're not in the hardcore database space, because when a lot of people that I've talked to think of evangelism or DevRel or contributions at Percona, they think like, oh my gosh, I need to focus on the hardcore back end engineering, and I don't want to learn how to code InnoDB or, write transactions or, fix the optimizer in Postgres. That's not true. That's not what we're looking for necessarily, because a lot of the people out in the community space, they're consumers of the technology that we're building. And so a lot of what we end up looking for are things like, how do you use Percona's products or PMM to build a better database? Where should you put it in your release pipeline? What sort of things should you be monitoring? You can also look at, application-specific things like, how do I build a new Node.js app and use Percona Server for my MongoDB or MySQL as the backend? These are things that are going to help new users do more. So it's not just about like this hardcore, like, how do I, scale a petabyte database, on, spread across 5,000 nodes, and what are the ins and outs of that? And it's not that, right? A lot of what, this DevRel world is looking for and desperate for is content that can connect with the end users, or in this case, the developers, who may not know how the databases or how the applications that they're deploying works, and they just want to get started. So that get started path is really important. We also love those hardcore engineers, don't get me wrong. And there is value there. It's just that you need to satisfy both those who are in the beginning of their journey and closer to the end. Don't be shy to reach out to me if you think you might be interested, you think you might know, you think I'm wrong, on what I said about this split in the community. I love to have talks. I love to debate. Believe me, I love to talk to people. And stop by our career page if you're interested in that, or if this isn't the role for you, but you listened all this way and you really want to work as a developer or an engineer, DBA, consultant. We have roles available across the world, so I would encourage you to check them out. You can also contact me if you want to ping me and talk to me about any of these. I am available all different kinds of places. Feel free to reach out to me on Twitter, email, LinkedIn, or on Discord. But I appreciate you listening, and I hope that this gave you some insight into what Percona is trying to do from a community perspective and where you might be able to fit in. Thanks a bunch, and we will catch you next time.